One of the biggest defining challenges of the 21st century is managing urban growth. In the Philippines, we have witnessed how our urban centers have creaked and groaned as poor urban management has only allowed inequalities to fester. The country has suffered poor mass transport, inadequate housing and healthcare, criminality and insecurity, unemployment, and other related problems. What we forget is that all these are inextricably linked and are quite challenging to unravel. In this episode, we talk about urban governance in the Philippines because urban decay,
Poor urban planning and policy development.
Poverty and inequality.
hindi na bago yan. Hi, I am Lee Candelaria.
I am Vecal Porha.
And I am Aaron Malyari.
This is Podcast, Conversations on Philippine History, Politics, and Society. Since we are at the tail end of the Duterte presidency and the dawning of a new one, it's about time we talk about that very crucial aspect of our lives. Lahat tayo na-experience natin ito, yung lumalalang sitwasyon ng pamumuhay sa mga syudad ng Pilipinas.
At ang hirap pag-usapan nito Una, kawing-kawing yung mga usapin. Nabanggit mo nga sa intro yung mass transport, housing, at iba pang mga issues. Tapos we also risk yung whataboutism na paano naman yung kanayunan. But I think we all agree that by talking about the woes of urban development in the country, we're only trying to put things in perspective kasi malaki talagang aspekto ng pag-unlad ng bansa. Ang pagsisiguro na yung antas ng pag-unlad ng mga siyudad natin ay naaayon sa maayos at angkop na polisiya.
Na talaga namang for me, I agree, no? Kasi kami ni Lee bilang mga wala sa Pilipinas at kasalukuyang nasa ibang bansa, well, ibang-iba talaga yung, I hate to say it, yung ginhawang ibinibigay ng mga maayos na daan, kawalan ng traffic, efficient public service, lalo na kung ikukumpara ko sa Pilipinas, unfortunately. At hindi naman kailangan mamuhay sa labas ng bansa para lang masabi nating may mali sa counterparts nito sa Pilipinas. Pero sabi mo nga, Vec, ang hirap pag-usapan ng topic na ito. Kaya sumangguni tayo sa isang development worker, scholar, urban planner, at kasalukuyang Ph.D. student from the University of Cambridge, si Ica Fernandez. Hindi na tayo nagpatumpik-tumpik pa at agad nating itinanong kay Ica, ano ba ang estado ng urban governance sa Pilipinas? Ito ang sagot niya.
I want to highlight how important the question of urban governance is to the Philippines. Pag sinabing urban governance, it's the way we're able to make decisions about how people live, work, and play, diba, in spaces, particularly urban ones. And yung sa ngayon, kalahati ng mga lahat ng Pilipino ay nakatira sa mga syudad. Pero pagdating ng siguro 2050, aabutin ng mga 84%. So, as they say, that the Philippines is rapidly urbanizing. And yung trajectory is usually most people in the rural areas to Metro Manila and other cities for the proverbial better life. So talagang ang reality is we have to think about how we can improve yung estado ng ating mga syudad for everyone. These cities are engines of growth, innovation, and prosperity for all. And if we want to do a more inclusive Philippines, lalo na ngayon na pagkatapos ng eleksyon, bagong administration na, we have to think about how we're able to plan, finance, design, and manage decisions for our country. So, ano bang status ng urban governance sa Pilipinas? Sad to say, medyo marami tayong kailangang habulin sa larangan na ito. Kasi for one, most Filipino decision makers are not used to thinking in terms of space and place. A lot of our programming is sectoral, pero iba kasi yung usapin ng mga syudad. So if I had to use one word to describe our current state of the sector, one is it's highly fragmented, And even yung term na ginagamit natin for today, yung urban governance, that's not an automatic assumption for many of our government decision makers. Hindi natin naiisip kung paano ba lumalapat sa lupa yung mga pangailangan at yung mga pangarap ng ating mga kasamang Pilipino. So, in terms of how that translates, you mentioned transport. Sad to say, many people I've spoken to, even yung mga urban specialists, don't think of transport as an intrinsic part of urban governance. And it's crazy, kasi it's the very lifeblood of our cities. So I think the latest number that most transport specialties uses a 2015 study from JICA, which found that only 12% of all Filipinos are car owners, which means that 88% of the population don't use cars, di ba? We commute, di ba, using mga bus, mga jeep, di ba? We walk, and then increasingly, especially after the pandemic, people are now cycling. However, a lot of our policies are still driven by cars. It's decided by people who use cars, who own cars, and therefore don't face the same challenges that yung regular commuters face every day. And so, for those who have been here in Manila, for the last few weeks, especially during the lockdowns, and then ngayon po, since they lifted yung work from home, grabe yung parusa sa mga tao, lalo na, so basic lang, di ba, na yung available supply of public transport is not meeting demand. So that's only one aspect of it, yung lack of affordable housing. Ang laki-laki ng ating unmet need for yung safe and adequate shelters for everyone, whether urban or rural conditions. Ito nga actually medyo malaking debate ito kasi even in ating government, merong different figures on how to estimate housing demand. And so, yung huling nakita ko is anywhere from 5 to 6 million yung unmet housing need, Kaya, for example, if you're in Manila, in Davao, or in Cebu, or any other major urban spaces, napakamahal ngayon ng renta, tsaka forget about owning a house. And most Filipinos, if you ask them, di ba, ang pangarap, makapundal, magkaroon ng bahay, di ba, na may tahanan. Pero even that is so difficult to reach for most people for various reasons. That also has to do with the way we're able to manage and use land, yung tinatawag na land use, di ba, na regulation. So, dahil mahal ang lupa, di ba, mahal ang bahay, mahal lahat. And it's also tied to yung as a function of transport. So, all of these basic things have knock-on effects on everything from food security. Ngayon, ang pinaka-maigting na challenge sa hindi lang sa Pilipinas, kundi sa buong humanity is climate change, right? And so, although the Philippines has been investing din naman sa disaster risk reduction and partially yung climate change adaptation, reality is our cities will be hitting, will be at the forefront of the climate change crisis, and being able to address that is going to be a serious challenge, not only in terms of cutting down on emissions, but also making sure that our cities are able to adjust. Ay ang problema, a lot of our urban development initiatives are still geared towards infrastructure. Yung joke nga na may mga ng mga ibang kaibigan, kung 'di ba sa gera may utak pulbura, meron din yung utak semento, 'di ba? Meaning a certain mindset which thinks that these big concrete mega projects are the solution to all your problems. These are just a few of the basic concerns, pero tari-tari sila lahat eh. And so yung challenge of an urban governance frame demands a certain creativity and expansion of thought na hopefully this next administration will be able to get to.
By 2050, 84% of Filipinos will live in cities. The Philippine population is estimated to be around 150 million by 2050. So, more than 120 million people will be city dwellers, more than the current total population of the Philippines today. And 120 million city dwellers, that's like 10 Metro Manilas. Siyempre, rough estimate lang ito, but can you imagine multiplying the problems of Metro Manila times 10? Ang sakit sa utak.
Pero kailangan din nating maunawaan na yung idea ng pamumuhay sa isang syudad, throughout our history, it has always been a very political and controversial conversation. Kasi halimbawa, noong dumating ang kolonyalismo sa atin, isa sa marker ng civilization na tinaya ng mga Europeo sa mga pinupuntahan nilang mga bansa, mga lugar, ay yung pagkakaroon ng isang quote-unquote civilized na pamumuhay, 'di ba? At yung civilization, it comes from the Latin word civitas, na nagpapakita nung pamumuhay sa isang organized urban setup. Kaya nga may kita natin since the ancient Greek times, 'di ba, yung polis at yung acropolis, yung idea na doon nakatira yung mga citizens, no? So, kaya ganun din. Kaya pagdating ng mga Espanyol, nung nakita nila na scattered yung mga barangay, dun sa checkbox nila, ay wala silang civilization. Kaya kailangan nung reduksyon, 'di ba? Kaya inorganize yung pamumuhay at nagtatag ng mga pueblo. 'Di ba? At may kita natin 'yan sa buong 300 years ng Spanish period, sinasabi ng maraming historians na hindi natapos yung proseso ng reduksyon kasi we can argue na hindi rin naman talaga nila tuluyang nasakop yung buong archipelago. And then syempre, pagdating ng mga Amerikano, yung mga urban planners dumating din sa Pilipinas. Halimbawa, may kita natin si Burnham, halimbawa kung nakapunta kayo sa Baguio, 'di ba, yung Burnham Park. So ito talaga yung mga dala ng mga pananaw nitong mga kanluranin na talagang magpapakita na ito yung testament na mayroong progress kapag nagkakaroon ng maayos na mga syudad. 'Di ba? Kaya yung mga kalsada, ganyan, 'di ba? Yan ay inintroduce sa atin ng western incursions sa atin. At syempre naranasan natin nung war, yung devastation kapag nawasak yung mga syudad kasi yun yung kailangan mong i-rebuild after. And then syempre, fast forward to martial law period, alam naman natin na yung isa sa argument ng mga may martial law nostalgia ay yun daw yung golden age ng infrastructure kasi ang daming mga napatayong mga daan, mga tulay, and so on. And then of course, hanggang sa pagtatapos ng diktadurya at ng kasalukuyan, napakalaking bagay na usapin yung pagpapagawa ng daan, lalo na pag may eleksyon, katulad nga ngayon. 'Di ba? At syempre, nitong Duterte administration, alam natin na yung build, build, build ay isa sa mga cornerstone ng kanilang propaganda, I dare say, sa pagpapalaganap ng ideya na umuunlad ang Pilipinas. No? So, it has always been political and it has always been politicized in many ways. And as Ica says, in its current state, fragmented ang urban governance ng Pilipinas. So, kahit na mahaba yung karanasan natin throughout our history sa pamumuhay at pamamahala ng mga syudad at pamumuhay ng mga tao, palagi pa rin mayroong discontinuities, disconnections between policy implementation at syempre doon sa mismong mga frameworks ng policies. And of course, pag binangga mo siya sa situation on the ground.
At tasampulan nga rin ni Ika, yung fragmentation na yan sa usapin ng transport. Halimbawa, it is very obvious, for example, how the government has viewed transportation as a very car-centric system instead of focusing on moving people. 12% lang ang car owners sa Metro Manila, and yet ang priority ng pamahalaan ay i-devote ang roads para sa mga kotse at hindi sa mass transport. Nabanggit din ni Ika yung housing in urban spaces. Pamahal ng pamahal ang renta at talagang hindi na accessible yung house ownership.
Amid all these inequalities, may climate crisis pa, dulot ng climate change. So, ang daming issues, ang daming problema, anong sagot ng pamahalaan? Sabi nga ni Ika, utak semento. Economists have already questioned the effectiveness of infrastructure as economic stimulus. But beyond that, I think what we're seeing is, especially under Duterte, talagang mahalaga sa kanya itong idea na may maiwang mga instruktura as his quote-unquote legacy. So, very reminiscent of Marcos nga, no? Nakita rin naman natin na sa panahon ng diktador na si Marcos, hindi naman talaga indicator ng pagunlad yung naglalakihang mga instrukturang naiwan niya.
Sabi rin ni Ika, our current idea of development has been based on outdated indicators, tulad na lang ng car ownership. Here's what she says about this.
We were fed the dream that the mark of economic mobility is to have a car. However, all conditions show that, one, it's not affordable. Not if only 12% of the population can afford to have a car. And also, at the same time, the climate crisis, the trajectory should be weaning from fossil fuels and looking at more sustainable forms of transport, which can be, either in active mobility forms like biking, or yung mass transport. At the end of the day, if we have more mass transport options, that's going to get rid of the need to have yung single-use cars na usually isa o dalawang tao lang yung may kinabang. And that also feeds to our eternal problem of traffic congestion sa Metro Manila, for example. People seem to think na the solution for a more comfortable ride is to have a car, or the solution to address traffic is to widen roads. When in fact, it's the opposite. The more you widen roads, the more congested it gets, especially if you're also not meeting yung mass transport demand.
Sa ibang bansa, pribilehiyo ang pagkakaroon ng sasakyan, kaya mataas yung barriers to owning one, especially in megacities like Tokyo in Japan. Dito sa Japan, yung driver's license, hirap na hirap nang kumuha yung mga tao eh.
Saka, bakit ka kasi magkokotse kung maayos yung mass transport, 'di ba? Kung mura ang pamasahe at komportable ang pagsakay. No, dito nga sa experience ko dito sa Vienna kasi many would say that Vienna has the most efficient transport system here in Europe. Talagang hindi ka malilate yung nakalagay sa Google Maps na schedule. Yun talaga yung nangyayari. So, kung ganun kaayos, talagang bihira kang makakita ng mga kotse sa daan kasi maayos yung tren, yung tram, yung bus, and so on. But sa Pilipinas, what is happening, talagang car owners ang focus ng pamahalaan. Di ba nga nung bago mag-Holy Week, nilimitahan ang mga provincial bus sa Metro Manila?
At ang tanga niyan, sa totoo lang, it feeds the unfounded and perhaps elitist na assertion na buses cause traffic, na nakakarinding marinig sa mga car owners na akala mo hari sa kalsada. Parang, talaga ba? Yung sasakyang may dalang 60 katao, halimbawa, yan ang nagkakos ng traffic, yung sasakyan mo, ikaw lang ang nakasakay. Siyempre, mag-rant na rin ako sa kawalan ng atensyon sa welfare ng bicycle riders. Dapat nga happy tayo na maraming nagbibisikleta ulit kasi una, hindi sila pampasikip sa daan. Pangalawa, environmentally sound pa ang pagbibisikleta. And yet, itong mga car owners, galit na galit din sa mga cyclists. Talagang pinipinahan niyang mga yan kahit nasa bike lane na maraming mga cyclists ang namamatay. And let's not even get to the fact that our cities aren't even walkable. Try mo lang maglakad sa EDSA. Talaga, di ba? So, halos wala nang sidewalk eh. So, paano, di ba? So, I think indicative ito ng pagtingin natin sa development. So, how should we really look at development? And Ica agrees with this. Ito ang sabi niya.
It goes back to mindsets and models, no? Di ba, sa development parlance, they call it yung theory of change, di ba? So, meaning, ano ba yung naratibo, no? How do you now, as the urban planners, no, as decision makers, how do you now understand what development is? Kasi if your model of development is a certain way, no, that affects the way that you plan, you design, you finance, everything, no? Kasi if yung pangarap mo, for example, is concrete and steel, diba, that presupposes a certain level, certain mode of thought that may not necessarily be fit for purpose of the situation or will align with the needs of the people involved. So sa akin, kailangan balikan yun diba? Ano ba yung modes of urban development over urban governance at ang focus na pangailangan ng mga tao that aligns with yung basic needs of the of the environment natin dito sa Pilipinas, diba? And addresses yung fundamental na pangailangan ng mga nakararami, hindi lang ilan.
Urban development that aligns with the needs of the people, not only the 12% of Metro Manila that owns cars, but more importantly, the greater majority na kailangang umasa sa mass transportation. Usapin din talaga ito ng inequality.
And also a question of how to achieve development din, ano? When Duterte came to power, we were promised the golden age of infrastructure as a way to spur development in the country through the Build, Build, Build program. Conventional economic wisdom tells us how important infra is for development, but build, build, build has become fail, fail, fail for so many reasons, and Ica tells us some of these.
Well, a lot of people are now weighing on build, build, obviously, pero let's go back to fundamentals. Number one, diba, infrastructure is good. We need good, solid infrastructure to grow, diba, to develop. We do need more bridges, we do need more good airports, we need good seaports, no question about it. Pero I think yung promise that was given 6 years ago, clearly by all metrics, including that of DPWH itself, clearly that promise has not been met. So if I remember my figures correctly, 6 years ago, yung original na target for Build was mga 8.4 trillion. Yung target around April, I believe, milinabas na figures, ang DPWH na out of the 119 flagship projects ng BBB, mga 12 lang yata yung natapos. And out of yung 8.4 na dapat nung simula nung Duterte administration, they brought it down to 5 billion. And even within that 5 billion, napakaliit mga siguro, out of 5 trillion rather, siguro mga 70.6 billion lang yung ating nagastos. No? So napakababa ng burn rate. And yung mga balak pa sana, for example, noon na karamihan dun sa mga projects would be locally funded, di ba, na hindi ganun karaming utang, no? Actually, that didn't happen kasi around three-fourths no, of those projects ay puro mga foreign grants and loans. So basic issues, one, hindi na nga na-implement yung sabing i-implement, 'di ba? Kasi the whole plan was to do accelerated, 'di ba? Implementation of projects and delivery. Parang sabi nila, it's tigil na yung plano, mag-deliver na tayo, pero even yung delivery hindi nangyari. Meaning the red tape that's always been there in government has not been cut. And second, in this na more sustainable forms of financing, no, medyo marami tayong utang as a result of yung build. So that doesn't also count the fact that not all of yung projects that have been implemented under build have been positively met by locals. So for example, two of the most controversial BBB bridges no in Metro Manila would be the one dun sa bandang Binondo, Chinatown, and then the other one sa may Rockwell Estrella. And in terms of design, in terms of yung functionality, most engineers, di ba, will say na there are certain design flaws, no, na hindi commensurate yung inutang sa anong binigay. And even in terms of yung heritage issues, di ba, in Binondo, no, medyo hindi siya okay. Bukod pa doon, meron din mga issues sa ibang BBB projects outside Luzon. If you remember, the recent typhoon, Odette, which hit parts of northern Mindanao and Visayas, I believe at least one big BBB project was found to be substandard. After hinagupit ni Odette, no, lumabas ng inaudit ng mga structural engineers, lumabas na despite the costs of investment, hindi siya up to scratch and therefore it's under investigation. So yun yung mga unmet promise of BBB.
12 out of 119 flagship projects. 50 trillion spending daw pero 70 billion lang ang natuloy. Golden age of utang actually ang nangyari. And Ica tells us, subpar pa yung ilan sa mga structures na naipatayo.
So talagang ano nangyari sa change is coming, ano? Change is scamming. Scam ito. Isang malaking budol. Itong build na ito. At ang nakaka-frustrate pa dito, many of the problems we face, kaugnay ng infrastructure, ng transportation, ng housing, ng urban governance as a whole, these are not new. Kaya nga hindi na bago yan ang title ng series na to eh. Pwede rin palang kakainis yarn or nakaka-frustrate yan, di ba? So what makes it so difficult for the country to have better urban governance? For Ica, the ongoing rehabilitation of Marawi, almost half a decade in the making, is a good example of what's wrong with our urban governance.
For Marawi, for example, no, you have a task force on Marawi, a big, massive interagency platform na medyo fragmented. It's also very top-down. It's national government implemented with limited roles for local actors. And take note, this is happening in the Bangsamoro, which is our first and only regional parliament, autonomous. No? So from that very perspective, medyo meron ka ng problema. And secondly, from the paradigm perspective, we have to remember na may differences talaga yung reconstruction paradigm if you're dealing with natural hazards, diba? Environmental hazards versus armed conflict, diba? But if you're applying yung physical frameworks ng DRR sa isang post-conflict context, may problema tayo doon. Sa planning side, for example, no, I'm not sure if most people know, pero in this, usually kasi for after events like this, dapat isang plano lang. Pero sa Marawi, dalawang plano ginawa. One for the battled area and one for the outside area. Financing is also an issue kasi sa laki ng problema, no, how do you ensure that yung adequate resources have to are channeled into these areas, diba? Short of, well, which follows a comprehensive plan. So kung sa plano pa lang may problema na tayo, paano pa yung financing, paano pa yung design, paano pa yung implementation. So for example, right now, well, Duterte, in the last days of the Duterte administration, he signed the Marawi compensation bill. Pero may mga challenges doon kasi one, the framework of compensation still follows yung standard road right of way. So kung natamaan ka ng kalsada, you will get compensation based on yung existing laws. Pero that doesn't cover compensation for your trauma. It doesn't cover compensation for deaths. It doesn't cover compensation for looting. Things like that. No? So may ganong challenges as well. So Not to mention, for example, the fact that, sometimes planning laws can be weaponized against people. So not just in Marawi, if you go to other disasters, ang madalas mong marinig ay no title, no return. Kung wala kang titulong malinis, hindi ka makabalik, di ba? Or if ikaw ay nasa tabi ng hazard area or tabi ng tubig, ikaw ay ma-resettle, di ba? With or without your consent. So it's a lot, no? So syempre, this kind of fragmentation I'm describing is also present not only, di ba, in Mindanao, but for example, also in NCR. So balik tayo sa Metro Manila, for example, and it goes back to also yung ating institutional arrangements. So NCR, Metro Manila, is comprised of 16 cities, di ba, and one municipality. We have an MMDA, but the MMDA doesn't have the teeth to adequately manage and consolidate yung directions of the entire area. And based on yung mga studies ng iba't ibang organizations, the real size of Metro Manila is not just those 16 cities in one municipality. I believe there was a World Bank study which looked at the true contiguous built-up area of Metro Manila as around mga 80-something cities covering Kamanaba, covering northern spillover areas. No? And so we don't have the institutional framework available to manage that kind of sprawl. And that's already Metro Manila, where up to 40% of our economic product is generated. What more pa sa Metro Cebu? What more pa sa Metro Davao? These are things we haven't really thought about.
Planning pa lang, problematic na pala. Ang daming disjuncture between policy and implementation. Ica also mentioned the weaponization of policy against the poor. So talagang may fragmentation in the way the government approaches urban governance. I think perfect example din yung MMDA and how this fragmentation is in plain sight. Na may tug of war between the autonomy and constituency ng local governments and this agency like the MMDA na trans-city or municipality naman ang mandate. So, wala talagang ma-achieve na substantial, it seems.
So what should we do? What kinds of reforms should we introduce to the way we approach urban governance? Here's what Ica thinks is necessary to do.
Yung usong catchphrase sa Pilipinas is yung bibingka approach na you have to be able to work from the top down but also apply heat from below. So in terms of yung reform ng urban governance ng Pilipinas, no, part of it has to be national but a lot of it is very local, and yung at the end of the day kasi LGUs yung frontliners sa urban governance, no, whether it's yung mayors, governors or mga kapitan. So from the national muna, no, babalik tayo sa basic plan ng Pilipinas, di ba, yung Philippine Development Plan, which sakto dahil bago presidente, kailangan gumawa ng bago. Although in the last administration, NEDA launched yung mas long-term plan, yung ambisyon natin 2040, no. And by law, yung ating mga national plans need to have a spatial component. There has to be a national spatial framework. And then yung sa ambition, similarly, there also has to be a long-term urban development framework. Technically, merong tinatawag dapat na NUDHF, National Urban Development Housing Framework, pero usually papel lang yan, hindi siya sinasabuhay, no? So ultimately kailangan i-review yon at kailangan siyang gawing mas ningipin, no? And then from there, pag nabuo yun dun sa long-term plan at sa PDP at sa NUDHF, dapat yun ay nakakabit sa iba't ibang aspects ng polisiya, financing, implementation, from housing to land use, no, to transport, to DRR down the line, no. Medyo marami din tayong batas na meron na. So part of it is implementing our laws, no. For example, we've had yung UDHA, diba, yung Urban Housing and Development Act for the longest time, no. And since we are talking about urban planning, bahagi dun sa UDHA, kailangan may mga 20% of any LGU has to be reserved for common and green spaces, which is important now, di ba? Kasi with the lockdowns, we realized kailangan palang urban spaces for mental health, for physical health, no? And even now with COVID, we realized na better ventilation is required. Pero minsan yung ginagawa ng mga LGUs, binibilang nila yung kalsado sa 20%. Di ba? Kaya mapansin mo sa NCR, halos wala ng green space natitira. So, yun, no, first of all, we have to be able to implement our law. And the last administration, part of their tasks, no, they were able to create yung bagong DSUD, di ba? Yung new Department of Housing and being able to ensure na yung that kind of work cascades na from the top down, no, will be important. But that said, although marami tayong batas na meron na, marami ding batas na hindi pa rin na-implement na, or napapasas. For example, a lot of your urban planners, yung holy grail natin ngayon is yung National Land Use Act, which has been languishing in Congress for, I guess, more than 20 years, if I'm not mistaken, no? And that kasi would be able to identify and provide protections kasi for in terms of land use. And the thing is though, and I don't want to name names here, but then very clear at the very top levels, merong conflicts of interest which blocks the passage of that bill in its various forms. And there are a lot of other alternative and green bills na pending dyan, di ba? Merong pending na yung Indigenous Communities and Conserved Territories and Areas Act, diba? There's a Sustainable Forest Management Act. So a lot of them are tied not only urban development but also yung rural development. And so, yun nga, medyo marami tayong kailangan gawin. So that's from the legal perspective, no? But from admin-wise, ang dami nating mandated actions, no, by law, pero hindi pa rin nagawa ng maayos. But at the end of the day, no, it has to be done at the ground level. So I did mention earlier na a lot of it has to be led by LGUs, being able to see yung land use plan, yung CLUPs ng LGU beyond something to cut and paste na for compliance lamang, but as a living document which reflects yung lived realities ng mga tao. Kasi right now, even within NCR, no, na medyo mayaman na, ilan lang yung mga LGUs na merong updated CLUP. Iba pa yung land use plan, iba pa yung kanilang shelter plans, iba pa yung transport plans. Yun, being able to think it through, finance it properly, and then implement in a way that is humane. So yun, definitely, yun yung mga aspects na yun. And then, in terms of yung mga infrastructure, kailangan i-review yung broader investment program natin sa Pilipinas, diba? Where we are going to be implementing projects which are not only flagship ng big ticket but also would contribute to the growth ng mga tao, inclusion, yung linking locations, pero din thinking about yung ating issue ngayon on the climate, no? So beyond concrete, no, what kinds of investments can we make in terms of energy, in terms of food security, in terms of DRR that can help us survive the climate crisis? Kasi you've seen the models in the next few decades will be NCR and other coastal areas in the Philippines will be submerged. So it's not going to be the next lifetime, it will be within our lifetime. So as early as now, kailangan na siyang mapag-isipan at tugunan ng pansin. So a lot of yung mga development workers were saying nga na parang dapat yung climate change would have been an election issue in the last May elections, but it wasn't. No? So hopefully this next new president, whoever he is or she is, will be able to address that in the next 6 years.
That was a very comprehensive response from Ica, which I think highlights the disconnect ulit between policy and implementation. Nabanggit din niya to an extent yung impact ng pandemya sa dapat na pagbabagong maganap sa paglapit natin sa usapin ng urban government sa Pilipinas.
Na dapat ay sana may kaugnayan din at responsive sa hamon ng climate change. Tumatak sa akin yung point na yun ni Ica na sana naging usapin nitong eleksyon yung climate crisis. Kasi dapat yung approach natin sa development ay hindi lamang ayon sa kung ano yung pangangailangan natin ngayon. Kung hindi, maging sa kung ano yung mga hamong haharapin natin sa kinabukasan.
Well, hopefully, i-take up yan ng susunod na administrasyon. On a final note, we asked Ica what her hopes are for the future of urban governance in the country.
Ayun, I really hope that things will change within our lifetimes, no? Kasi in terms of yun nga, the planning, the financing, design, di ba, implementation, all of these things, no? Kasi they say that yung mga cities natin are built environment is a reflection of our politics and the way we treat ourselves and each other. So pag pangit, pag hindi makatao, hindi makatarungan ng syudad mo, what does it say about who we are as a people? It will take a lot of work, a lot of soul searching and effort as well for people to change these relationships, these social dynamics, and then translate them into the built environment. No? And I'm still hopeful that we'll see it in our lifetime. Kasi it's not just something na motherhood, no? It's a question of survival.
Pag pangit, di makatarungan, di makatao ang syudad mo, what does that say about who we are as a people? Ang bigat nun.
Tsaka sabi rin ni Ica, no, sa kadululuhan, usapin ito ng survival, which makes the issue of urban governance an essential campaign we must take on.
We would like to thank Ica Fernandez for her time and expertise. Masalimuot na usapin ang topic natin at marami pang insights si Ica that we could not fit in this episode. Kaya naman head on over to our website podcast.org to watch our full interview with Ica.
And that's it for our episode today. Tuloy-tuloy lang tayo sa ating season na hindi na bago yan. So please visit and follow or subscribe our social media pages for updates on the show. Babalik tayo next week, but for now, stay safe and have a good day.